Welcome to Brandywine Museum Online. I'm Mary Cronin, Brandywine's Director of Audience Engagement. Tonight, we're pleased to present one in an ongoing series of Wyeth Conversations, featuring Dr. Kathleen A. Foster, the Robert L. McNeil Jr. Senior Curator of American Art and Director of the Center for American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in conversation with Dr. William L. Coleman, Brandywine's Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center. During the program, you may add questions into the Q&A feature or comments into the chat. We're recording the program and will send out the link in about a week. The program will also be posted on Brandywine Museum's YouTube channel. To discover more about Wyeth Art, please note these upcoming online programs. All of them are available for registration on Brandywine's website. On April 29th and 30th, Victoria Wyeth will discuss the art of her grandfather, Andrew Wyeth, during the period from 1945 to 1965. On May 22nd, Jamie Wyeth will be in conversation with Brandywine's Senior Curator, Dr. Amanda Burden. They will discuss the work featured in Brandywine's current exhibition, Jamie Wyeth Unsettled, on view at the museum through June 9th. And on August 28th, join us for a conversation with William Coleman and Melissa Reckner, a naturalist and program manager at Brandywine Conservancy's Penguin Court Preserve, as they explore images from every leaf and twig, Andrew Wyeth's botanical imagination. That exhibition is currently on view at Brandywine Museum until September 15th. And now to begin tonight's program, I'll turn this over to Will Coleman.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for being with us tonight. I'm really looking forward to getting to know better somebody who's been a real hero of mine personally, but we'll try to keep it all professional and at a kind of bird's eye view of a really interesting life in the field of art history of the United States that has intersected with the work of Andrew Wyeth in a number of interesting ways. My personal disclosure is 2 periods of working in her department, that august Department of American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art back in 2006 and again in 2013, where I got to learn at the feet of this really inspiring figure in our field. And just in talking through what we might discuss today, I've already learned so much more. So I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Kathy Foster, and I hope you'll join us with your camera on there, Kathy, and we'll dive right into this conversation. And maybe the place to begin, Kathy, is how did you come to this unusual field of art history in the first place, and where did you first encounter the work of Andrew Wyeth?
Well, you can show a picture that I picked for you to show where I came from. I am a girl from the Golden West, and although I was always teased in college about whether or not there was running water and electricity in our home in Portland, Oregon, in fact, it was quite a civilized environment. My father was a doctor and a musician and an amateur watercolor painter, and my mother was an actor and a dancer and the chairman of the guides at the Portland Art Museum. And so as a child, I remember the kitchen table being stacked with all of the preparations for the docent training when the great Vincent van Gogh touring exhibition came through, or a fabulous Salvador Dali show. And once we had the Kerelic collection highlights from Boston. So as a kid, I had the director of the art museum in my house, Dr. Newton. Rachel Griffin, who was the curator of the museum, was my mother's best friend. So I had a model of what it was about to work in a museum, because I spent a lot of time in a museum as a kid. So, I mean, I took a lot of art classes at the museum school, and all the faculty from the museum school, my mother collected their work, and it was around our house. So I didn't think about this really until many, many years later, but I was kind of raised to be a museum curator. And when I went off to college, and that lower slide there is Wellesley College, it didn't really occur to me to be a curator, but studying art history made a lot of sense to me. And so I dove in really, even as a freshman, taking a lot of art history. What's interesting in looking back is that I was actually taught at Wellesley to disdain Andrew Wyeth. Wyeth, the regionalists, Thomas Hart Benton, all those people, my professor at Wellesley really had nothing much to say about them. And so I had to unlearn some of the prejudices that I learned. This, of course, is, I think, typical of the 1960s, when Wyeth, I think, was under siege by the modernists. And so, and my teacher was a high modernist, abstract expressionist, post-painterly abstraction scholar. So I had to unlearn some of what I learned at Wellesley, but I unlearned it pretty fast when I got to graduate school. I went to Yale, and I was at Yale. My advisor was a friend of the Wyeths, and he rigged up for me a fellowship from the Wyeth Foundation. Andy and Betsy, very early this is in the 1970s, had a foundation that was doing good works for American art. And my advisor went to them and suggested that they help me as I was trying to finish my dissertation research. So we actually went off to Chadds Ford, and I remember very well a wonderful luncheon with Jamie and Phyllis and Andy and Betsy. And so that was my chance to actually meet them all in person. And as you can imagine, I was unmaking, or I was unconstructing the prejudices that I had learned in college by the time I was meeting Andy Wyeth in person. And certainly my professor at Yale was a big admirer. This is Ted Stebbins. And so that my opinion was being changed in the middle of the 70s.
That's a really fascinating beginning about which I had no idea. And for our attendees, you may be interested to hear that these Wyeth Foundation fellowships are now a really well-established phenomenon that has supported decades of scholars in the field of art history of the United States. So little did I know, Kathy was the first of that kind, and incredible to think.
I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, incredible to think about that period going to Chadds Ford. From that Yale beginning, how did you get your start in museum work? You were steeped in art history in general, but you found your way specifically to this incredible career in museums and Wyeth along the way.
I was so lucky. Yale has a fantastic graduate program that involves the students right away in their in the work at the museum, the Yale University Art Gallery. So I definitely got my feet wet when I was in graduate school. And then my first job coming out of, I always was sort of doing a balance between teaching and museum work. My first job was actually at Temple in Philadelphia, and at Williams College. And so I started off teaching art history, but always in those jobs, I was like trying to build a connection to the real thing, to the actual objects, bringing the students into the local museum or meddling at the Williams College Museum. And in Philadelphia, I soon found my way to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And that was where I got my first full-time curatorial job as an assistant curator in the late 70s. And here again, I bumped into the Wyeths because in 1981, I think, Jamie Wyeth had his first big East Coast retrospective that was organized by Frank Goodyear at the Pennsylvania Academy. And I was Frank Goodyear's sidekick and the co-curator of that show. I remember writing the labels for that and doing the installation. So Jamie was on hand, got to like reacquainted, in fact, became great friends with Jamie in the course of that installation. I don't remember Andy being on hand much for that, but certainly Jamie was, and he brought Andy Warhol with him to the opening, which was so exciting. This particular painting of Andy was in that survey of Jamie's. So it was a second chance for me to kind of get to know the Wyeth family, get to understand the Wyeth traditions, this in 1981. So you can see I'm kind of being brought into the fold here in the early 80s.
And we should mention that this painting that came to Kathy's mind as a shout out to that long ago Jamie project is currently on view at the Brandywine in Jamie Wyeth Unsettled. So we're getting to know that well. It was fascinating to hear some of the Warhol and Jamie stories from the new documentary forgetting the name of it, but this incredible new Glenn Holston documentary about J.B. Wyeth's career, those stories of this factory and the drama and glamour, and how exciting that you intersected with that fascinating chapter. So through this journey, you've come to be, I think it's fair to say, particularly associated with expertise in the medium of watercolor, from doctoral dissertation right through to your legendary recent exhibition on American watercolor, The Age of Homer and Sargent. How did you come to that particular interest, and can you give us some sense of how that medium, which is so important to Wyeth, fits into the history of art of the United States?
I think that's true. I think that that watercolor was the way, one way into the understanding of Andy Wyeth. And it happened for me back at Yale. I said I was so lucky to be involved in a lot of projects at Yale, but they offered so many opportunities for the students to work at the art gallery in different projects. And Ted Stebbins basically just said to me, how would I like to organize an exhibition about Edwin Austin Abbey, because Yale is sitting on a collection of more than 3,000 works by Abbey. His entire estate came to Yale in the 1930s or early 40s, and it had been in the basement, for decades. And so I just went down to the basement and started going through all of this incredible work and fell in love with Edwin Austin Abbey's watercolors. And here are two of them. They are extraordinary, enormous watercolors of amazing finish. And I think you can sort of understand how my appreciation for watercolor in Abbey's work could easily be translated into an understanding of the beauty of Wyeth's sense of realism. But the Abbey story, ironically, I worked on this catalog and described the paintings, the oil paintings. Another scholar worked on the watercolors. But while I was doing research, I began to stumble across all of these newspaper accounts from the 1870s and 80s about Abbey's celebrity in this period as a watercolor painter. He was definitely, his reputation was made in watercolor before he ever laid his hand on oil. And he was best known as a pen and ink illustrator and a watercolorist. And so that was interesting to me, that he became a star in the medium of watercolor. And then the second thing that was interesting was that the buzz all around these newspaper clippings about how excited everybody in New York was about watercolor painting, and how everybody was starting to paint watercolors. And that realization that there was a phenomenon happening around 1880 around watercolor painting that made me dive in and actually choose this to be my dissertation topic, like the story of why watercolor and what was this enthusiasm for watercolor at this time. So by this time I already had worked a lot on Thomas Eakins. I did my master's on Thomas Eakins, and I've written a number of books about Eakins. So Eakins watercolors were also very well known to me at this time, but when I started to put pictures together, I began to realize that both Eakins and Homer were painting watercolors in a very similar mode. I mean, different in style, but different in their focus on sunlight and on outdoor subjects, but in this dramatically different personalities. But both of them turned to watercolor in 1873 with zeal. And I kind of went, what is going on here? Both of these two artists, different in age, different in temperament, different in their background histories, both showed up at the Watercolor Society exhibition in 1874 with boys in boats. And I just said, something's going on here. So this became the kind of the core of my dissertation, which was about the story of this enthusiasm, how many artists from all across the art world were drawn to watercolor in this period of the 1870s and early 80s. So to make a long story short, if we take like Winslow Homer to the end of his career, by the time you get to the turn of the century, around 1900, Homer and Sargent are the two great names in American watercolor by the early 20th century. You have another slide that you can show the two of them. Yeah, here we go. Turn of, 1899 for Homer, Sargent in 1917. These are the two kings of watercolor, and they have risen on this wave of excitement and enthusiasm, collecting enthusiasm and artists personal investment in watercolor that's been happening in the 20 years since the kind of first flush of interest in the 1870s. Well, it's not long. This is Sargent's fabulous Muddy Alligators from 1917. This is just exactly when Andrew Wyeth is born. He's born into this moment when watercolor painting is really a big deal. It's become the American medium, and I put quotation marks around that because that's the press called watercolor as by this time they found it was somehow ingrained in the American personality, that it was an appropriate medium for watercolor for American artists. And as Wyeth is born and is growing up, indeed, all of the great artists of the early 20th century that he would have been looking at were all watercolor painters. And I mentioned John Marin, but also Charles Birchfield, and particularly Hopper, who was basically Wyeth's early hero as a young man, certainly as he's beginning to take up watercolor himself in the 1930s. So there was a natural link for me from like this late flourishing of watercolor from the watercolor movement of the 70s into the early 20th century into what happens to Wyeth. How does he learn watercolor? There's a interesting comparison here that you can show between Homer and Wyeth, the early Wyeth watercolors. This is one of the watercolors at the Philadelphia Museum of Art from Andy's early years when he was like still a teenager and selling his watercolors, selling out his shows at the Macbeth Galleries in New York. And I show this alongside a Winslow Homer watercolor, also from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, that is part of a gift of watercolors that were given to the PMA by the Woodwards in 1939. And Andy has said to me that as a kid, as a young adolescent, he would come to the Philadelphia Museum every summer to see the Winslow Homer watercolors. And when you see these two things side by side, Homer from 1880, from that first moment of excitement in American art for watercolor, and you see Wyeth as a young man here, his house on Winter Hill, he is channeling Winslow Homer. And I think it's not only that he admires Homer's love of the outdoors and his sense of the atmosphere, but his love of the medium. I mean, the juiciness of these, the sense of the wetness of the washes, the fabulous spontaneity of it. This is done so rapidly and with such confidence. To think of how young he was when he was doing these incredible watercolors. Mm-hmm. So for me, I immediately recognized that Wyeth was in this same tradition that I'd been studying and writing about. He was like the natural heir to the watercolor movement of the late 19th century. And, you know, the more I looked into his watercolors, I insisted on including one of his watercolors in my book because I just think his watercolors are so fantastic. I mean, he's just one of the greatest watercolor painters of the 20th century in American art around the world, and just an incredible watercolor artist. So my appreciation for Wyeth, I think, comes out of all of these years of me studying how difficult watercolor is, how hard it is, and how good Andy Wyeth is.
Mm-hmm. That's hugely helpful just to understand your unique perspective on this medium, how Andrew Wyeth fits into the history of the medium. It inspires a follow-up question, if I can go back to the Abbey slide, which is one of the many narratives about the watercolor Wyeth as opposed to the tempera Wyeth, is that he sort of supposedly invents this mode of watercolor called dry brush. And I would love to hear your reflection on that in relation to the incredibly finely refined surfaces of Abbey. Do you buy that story? It is a really interesting inherited narrative about where value lies in Wyeth's watercolors. What do you make of dry brush?
I've of course read what Andy Wyeth had to say about his dry brush watercolors, and what he claimed I would give him credit for. That is, that he was trying to find something that mixed the spontaneity of watercolor, which to him always was about youthfulness and about abandon and about freedom and about like excitement and all of those qualities of emotion. He wanted to find something that added a little bit of muscle to those watercolors. And the dry brush gave him a chance to give a little bit of weight, of finish, of like depth to this free-flowing watercolor style. So he was trying to bring the discipline of his temperas together with the spontaneity of watercolors. And he found this middle road, which are the dry brushes, which are big and which will incorporate these splashy abstract sections, and then some sections that just focus in exactly as Abby did, with a kind of detail, or with a strong buildup of color, so that you get like saturation created by this hatching that he would do with a squeezed brush, splaying the hairs of the brush out so that he could kind of do cross hatching. Now that, I don't know whether he can claim to have invented this, but it certainly was a personal resolution for him. In other words, I'm sure you could go out into the world and find other artists who had that same range within their watercolors. I mean, Winslow Homer, for example, would occasionally like focus in on something, and then the corners of the watercolor would be very broad and washy. Nobody made it into kind of an item the same way that Wyeth did. And so that's why I allow him the sort of taking authorship for this idea of the dry brush, because it's a very personal choice of his. And I don't think he learned it from anybody else. Wyeth, in a weird way, is, he's a sponge. He's looking through books a lot. He is certainly going to exhibitions. But on the other hand, he's not a scholar. He's not really a studious a person. And so I don't know who he would have looked at that would have given him this idea. I would tend to think it's his. I'd give it to him.
Okay, that's helpful to hear. It comes up so much. Our current theory is we call these things dry brush watercolor, as opposed to the Betsy James Wyeth philosophy, which we greatly respect and understand, of calling these things full stop dry brush as a self-sufficient medium. That's how important it was. I've been fascinated to play around with that Google Ngram tool, where you can see the historic incidence of language. Dry brush spikes in the lifetime of Andrew Wyeth and declines after. It does correlate in a really interesting way. So we're always wrestling with that, and great to hear your perspective on it.
They are all watercolors. And
Yeah.
so dry brush watercolor is more correct. Dry
Okay.
brush is not anything different than just a watercolor technique.
Okay. I hope our attendees will forgive that bit of perhaps inside baseball.
That's a
where
little
we're trying
geeky,
to,
but yeah.
yeah, we're really trying to get to the meat of these issues in Wyeth world. That's what this Wyeth conversation series is for. We're learning at the feet of the master of the medium of watercolor in the United States. So really great to hear that. There is an elephant in the room with this medium, which is that historically it was supposedly a ladies' art. Is that not the case? And we're talking about the boys' club here. Can you help us to reckon with that? How it becomes a macho art of Adirondacks hunting and all that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. By the time you get to Homer and Sargent, it's all about being manly. And so it was very interesting for me to track this, because the legacy of watercolor painting definitely carried with it this baggage of it being the medium that many amateurs used, and that children often used, and that ladies used. And it is often described as the ladies' medium. And so the founders of the Watercolor Society in the 1860s and 70s had to overcome this prejudice that it was somehow a weaker and more feminine, they seen as a weakness. However, they charged in. And so even from the early days of Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins, you can see them taking this completely seriously as a professional medium. And there's no hint here of it being somehow inept or second class. What was appealing to these artists in the 70s and 80s was that it was generally more accessible to collectors. The prices were lower. The collectors surged out. I mean, don't we all wish we had a time machine to go back and buy a Winslow Homer watercolor for $50, okay? you could get a $50 Winslow Homer or Thomas Eakins. And so that was it was a professional choice to try and market your work to a new field. Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that the whole ladies thing turned around and became an advantage for women artists, because women often had been learning watercolor when they were girls at school or from their mother at home, and they brought this skill with them to the art business. And so in the 1870s, what you found was the ladies' medium allowed a lot of women to actually get their foot in the door of the art world, to get jobs in illustration, in decorative design, and in all the kinds of arts and crafts fields that you use watercolor as a design tool. So the fact that it was a ladies' medium actually armed many women who could then make a career. And I'm going to mention Fidelia Bridges, who was a student of William Tross Richards here in this region. Bridges became a household name entirely based on her watercolor painting. And so the idea that you could take watercolor and actually use it as a tool to create a professional career, that was the ladies' medium suddenly becoming an advantage.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. Fascinating to hear about that journey with this art form. And we're so fortunate now to have the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth collection managed by the Brandywine that is majority watercolor, majority unseen watercolor, this amazing family collection. So we're spending a lot of time with this medium, really helpful to see it through your eyes. Now, I'd like to spend most of our remaining time on one particular Wyeth project. Our journey here has brought us to Wyeth studying at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Wyeth in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and then to your role in a key exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 2006, which happened to be the summer of my undergraduate internship. So I got to see Kathy giving tours of this exhibition. It was a formative experience for me and for many. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be boots on the ground, to use an appropriate metaphor? You like that? Executing this exhibition in its Philadelphia venue.
Yes, this was my deep dive into Wyeth world, and it was such a pleasure. It really was such a pleasure. This is the painting Trodden Weed on the right, which is the painting that you can see distantly through the doorway. So it was our title image. It is seen as a self-portrait of Andrew Wyeth, although maybe actually it's Betsy in these boots, but in any event, the autobiographical quality of this painting was a reason that we decided to put it on the title wall. Well, how it all came to pass was our director at the time, the beloved Anne Darnancourt, got wind of an exhibition, a Wyeth exhibition that was being organized by the High Museum in Atlanta. And she picked up the phone and said, "Oh my gosh, I've always wanted to have a Wyeth exhibition come to Philadelphia. We've always wanted Andy to have a big retrospective here in his sort of hometown, and can we partner with you?" And then Anne turned around and assigned me and the Michael Taylor, who was curator of contemporary art and who logically would be dealing with a living artist. But she thought the two of us would be a good team to put this show on the walls in Philadelphia. Well, Michael actually got almost immediately hijacked by two other big loan shows. And so suddenly him doing 3 shows was just too much. It was the Salvador Dali show and I think, well, can't remember, but anyway, he got distracted or overworked. And so suddenly I became the team captain. I think Anne chose me partly because she knew of my expertise in watercolor, but also because of my long experience with Eakins and with realism. I was a friend of American realism. I understood realism as a strategy of making art. And so she said, "Kathy, you usually don't work with living artists." I did a lot when I was at the Pennsylvania Academy, but when I came to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I was really kind of put in the historical American art category. But I said, "Oh, I'd be delighted." So I stepped up to work with Ann Knutson, who was the curator in Atlanta, to put the checklist together and then to work on the installation, the labels, and the programming for this show. It was a lot of work, but it was really fun. I had a chance to interview Andy about his work, deciding to, well, maybe we'll get to that later. We can talk in a larger sense about what the main goals of this exhibition were. And by now, I told you I started out in the 1960s, basically not having a high opinion of Wyeth's work. By now, I'm really determined to try and bring people on board to understand what Wyeth was all about and how great he was. I mean, if I had a single goal in this show, it was to make the people who were the Wyeth haters come to this show and leave it liking Wyeth. I mean, that was my mission. And it worked. It was very successful, but I'm here to say, stepping down from that larger mission, I wanted Wyeth to look modern. I didn't want him to look like nostalgic and old-fashioned. I wanted to focus on this man of the 20th century and put him in the frame of the late 20th century so people could understand the abstraction of his work and the emotional power of it that was completely in sync with abstract expressionism, with other great, late 20th century painting. So he's coming out of a realist tradition, but he's not some kind of a throwback or some kind of a dinosaur. He's a person of the 20th century. So I wanted the paintings to look tough. I wanted them to look abstract. And so that was sort of a direction as we sort of honed the checklist, because of course, like you'll understand, we started with like 400 things on the checklist, and you had to like whittle it down to make it doable. So we wanted to have only the strongest work. Then the other thing that I really wanted to do, and I can stop here for a minute and point to the pictures here, these great through the window kind of compositions that are so evocative, but also so austere, so abstract. The great soaring painting that you can see there that is, a kind of experience of dizziness. And then through the door, you can see that we occasionally had paintings on accent walls, and putting important pictures, sort of don't miss this painting kind of cues to the visitors. But by and large, the walls were white because also we wanted to give a kind of Museum of Modern Art ambiance here, that this is modern painting here. This is not some kind of 19th century, throwback. And so the installation was very spacious and clean. Here's another example of how we'd use these color walls to just sort of focus on important pictures. You can see weirdly at the right, the Spring Fed, which is one of my favorite paintings on the diagonal here to you, and River Cove on the other slide way over on the left, an astonishingly abstract painting. I mean, this is a painting of a river with the tide ebbing on the pebbles on the shore, the reflections of the trees in the water, so that you have a complete experience of being at the water's edge. But at the same time, this is just Franz Klein in terms of its composition. And I want to shout out to the Abstract Flash exhibition, Will, that you just had at the Brandywine, which I think showcased that quality of abstraction that is in every bone for Wyeth. He's thinking about these compositional issues. It's not just about description. So these were some of the themes that I was trying to bring out in the exhibition to give each painting a lot of room, and to highlight certain paintings of real power.
I can attest from the front lines what a landmark project this was, that we still refer back to the catalog regularly, that there is an effort going on right now to potentially reprint that catalog because it is still so much in demand. It laid the groundwork for a lot of our work in ways we can flesh out a little more later. Didn't this period also on a personal level bring you back to Chad's Ford for a Christmas party? I think it was. That was.
Oh yes, the Syphilis Christmas party. Yes, Anne Darnancourt was in. They would always invite sort of a mystery guest to their Christmas party with Andy and Betsy. And Anne Darnancourt, the director, was the mystery guest that year. And she brought me along kind of in the entourage. So it was fun to just have some Christmas holiday spirit with the Wyeths. And Andy was completely delighted. He and Anne, I think, I told you that Anne was the person who just reached out to try and make this exhibition happen at the Philadelphia Museum of Art because of her longstanding appreciation for Wyeth's work. And so he understood that Anne was one of his great admirers, and he was so delighted to have a person of her eminence surprise him at the Christmas party.
There you go. And this surname Sapala might be familiar to Wyeth fans from serving as a model for the painting Marriage and Their Home, featuring in Painter's Folly, a number of others. So yeah, that was a great little vignette of how you're navigating Wyeth world. Now, to dive deeper on one really important part of this exhibition, can you tell us what's going on in this section?
Well, this is another one of the goals that I didn't mention, a sort of a third goal in this exhibition, was to try to explain what realism was to Wyeth, because I think people had a notion that he just sort of sat down, and this is, of course, the people who don't like Wyeth very much, that he just sort of sat down and somewhat mechanically painted what was before him. And I wanted people to understand, you know, the magic, the memory and magic. That was the title of the show. And so the reason, or the way that I thought the tool to do this was to show how he put a painting together, and how complicated and how full of revision and how full of imagination and memory and magic a painting like Groundhog Day here is, and how far it is from being just like a routine depiction of everyday life in the Kerner kitchen. So what we did was pull from the studies for this painting and show them in a kind of sequence down the wall, so that you could walk from the right to the left and then end at the painting and kind of take the journey with Wyeth as he put this painting together. And it was, I mean, astonishing for me as a scholar, as a historian, to figure this out myself, to lay out all these drawings. There's like 60 preparatory drawings for this painting, and many of them you would never know were for this painting, except that Betsy picked them up off the floor and numbered them after the painting was finished. And so she knew that it was part of the project. So what I did in trying to like walk through the process of the painting was put the sketches in order and think about what happened first, what happened second, etc. And what I discovered was an enormous process of elimination of things that were first included and then got cut from the painting. And in fact, Andy says something like, it's not so important what's in the painting, it's what you take out of the painting. And I saw that happening in this picture. What you've got, just to study it for a minute before we pause and look at some of these drawings and watercolors, is the kitchen table in the Kerner farm with Carl Kerner's lunch set out waiting for him. So right away, there's a sense of expectation of somebody who's not in the picture, who either just got up and left or that we're waiting for. But that's just kind of the beginning. So let's look at the drawings. I was very lucky in that this has been a painting that's been very famous for a long time. It was purchased when it was brand new by the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1959 for a lot of money. And so that made a lot of headlines. And so people have been coming after Andy over time, asking him about the making of this painting. And so there were many accounts from him, and then I was able to interview him as well about the making. And what he said was he had lunch in the Kerner kitchen all the time, and so he was very familiar with this. But one day in the fall of '58, he went out and sat up on the hill outside looking down on the Kerner house, which is an image that appears often in his work. And he began to think about Anna Kerner, Mrs. Kerner, down there in the kitchen with their dog. And so he pulled out his pocket notebook, which he never leaves home without, and began to make sketches from his imagination, remembering the kitchen and just thinking, Is there a painting here? Is there a subject here? With Anna by the window and the dog on the floor next to her. So these are not done on the spot. These are done from memory. And so it's something to remember, that someone like Andrew Wyeth, who, you know, for decades and decades was drawing and drawing and drawing. He cultivated the most amazing memory in the process of this kind of work so that he could summon up things in his mind's eye in a way that I think you and I are incapable of. But anyway, so this is Anna. So let's move on to the next set of drawings. He comes down now and he starts to get Anna to pose for him. He's got this idea of a painting. And so he poses her in front of the window. She is an unhappy model. She was actually a very strange woman that is silent, I think very wounded by World War, let's see, II, and their immigration and the difficulties of her life. She was silent and somewhat reclusive, and she was not happy modeling. And so he tries a few of these sketches with her, but he's not very satisfied with them. And so gradually we see Anna kind of leave the picture and the shift in his focus turn to the dog that was at her feet in those first pictures. And the dog, I love this drawing of the dog asleep with the window above the dog, kind of like the dog's dream bubble. You know, it's like a thought image of the dog imagining being outside. This was a guard dog and a vicious dog. The dog's name was Nellie and was a nasty dog. And I'm quoting literally from Andrew Wyeth. Nellie was nasty, but when she was asleep, of course, she's peaceful. He's able to draw her. But there is a threat in this dog always, because the dog's job basically is to bite your leg if you try to come up to the house. So there's that element of the tranquility of the dog versus the possibility that that dog's going to wake up and bite you. The other thing I love as a watercolor painter is this amazing study that's on the left that shows him experimenting with the colors of the dog's fur and using his fingers to taking his finger and dipping it into one color and then making fingerprints like printing color across the dog. It's fantastic, and it's so typical of Wyeth's improvisational technique that he would take, you know, a lump of grass and scrub it on the paper. He would take the sleeve of his shirt. I mean, he would just improvise, and the suggestion of fur that he gets in this is just wonderful. Well, so he starts to think about the dog. He's also thinking about this table, and the table kind of emerges somewhat in the drawings of Anna Kerner, but the idea of the missing Carl Kerner is starting to kind of lurk in his imagination. And what you can see from his early sketches that feel like they really were drawing from life is a delicious looking German bread and some cutlery and the teacup and so forth that we notice in the final painting. These things get pared down. It becomes almost monastic. And so instead of being a tasty, like tea time, it suddenly becomes more austere and spare, so that the domestic softness that you find in this little watercolor, it gets hardened up in the painting. Like I also love, as a watercolor fan, his studies of the wallpaper. I mean, he's just going around the kitchen, he's looking at everything, he's making studies of the repeated water pattern in the paper, which is an old-fashioned printed wallpaper, so you get the sense of the antiquity of this wallpaper, that it's been on that kitchen wall for a while, but he is like very carefully studying the repeat pattern in that. So just to show you the kind of research that he's doing here as he's circling this subject and thinking about what he wants to include and what he doesn't want to include. Mm-hmm. Well, what happened next is he goes outside, and we have those next pictures. He circles the house and he looks back at the window, and that's the window that you can see. Maybe you can put your little arrow on the dark window on the house. Yeah, there it is. That's the window that you were once inside looking out. And now he's on the outside, and in typical fashion, he doesn't do all the windows on the back of the house. He just does that one window and then the little window up under the eaves. So he's already starting to like be selective. Well, what he's focusing on in the image on the left, which is in the Delaware Art Museum, is this log, this big log that Carl Kerner, a tree cut down and he dragged up to the house and it got stuck. It's firewood, and he's going to chop it up, saw it up, and chop it up for firewood. But it got stuck, and then the snow came, and so there's this giant log, which is in the most sinister fashion, looking at the window in the kitchen, right? So the log, in Andy's imagination, it's a living being. I mean, it's a monster. It's like a dragon. It's some kind of primordial beast. And it seems to be like threatening the house, and it's threatening Anna. I mean, that's the window where she's inside. So it's this, what can I say, masculine image focusing on the kitchen and Anna inside. Well, as he was doing these drawings, these watercolors, and this is actually done outdoors in the snow, the dog goes running by. And it's one of those wow moments for Andrew Wyeth. The dog sneaking by the house on the loose, predatory, looking like a wolf. Now, you can imagine a dog running by the house. That must have happened in about a split second. And yet Andrew Wyeth was able to go back to a piece of paper and draw the dog from memory, capture its skulking sense, its danger, its stealth. I mean, it's just an amazing ability too, because the dog was not going to stop and pose. So there's the log behind, there's the dog. And then Andy, in his interviews over time, has said, and suddenly the dog went away and it became the log. And the dog and the log kind of merged. And so then you have one last great drawing that we had in the exhibition of the chained log. This is the log that you see outside the window, through, over the table and out the panes. This chained log, which indeed had a chain on it, because that's how Carl Kerner dragged it up the hill with his tractor. But and this is Andrew Wyeth talking. He said, the splinters on the log became like the fangs of that scared dog. And so he is, in this drawing, pulling out that kind of latent threat in the log, the sense of violence, the sense of the log as a kind of malevolent being that is chained up outside the kitchen. I mean, this is Andy talking. He's thinking these things as he's drawing this. And then when he comes back to put the painting together, and let's look at the last slide that shows you the painting again, you get a sense of the log outside the window. Oops, sorry, let's just keep moving.
Sorry, wait, one more. Yeah, we've got an order here. There we go.
There we go, to the final. There's the log again. Now, the final painting, I think after even this quick sketch of just, half dozen of the studies, and there are 60 of them, you can see how he has put things together in the final painting in a completely fresh, an original composite that is based on memory. That is not actually what he saw out the window, because he's placed everything where he wants it to be, and he's eliminated the stuff that he didn't want to have. And so the final picture is really a complete artifice. It's something made up out of memory. And it does create this sense of magic, of this sense of the violence, the threat that you see. Even people who don't know what's going on, it makes you uncomfortable to look at that tree outside the window, at that log. And then the sense of the missing people in the painting, of Carl, who hasn't come back for lunch yet. So in summary for Wyeth, he said, when someone asked him, what is this painting about? He said, it's about peace and it's about suppressed violence. That's his statement about the meaning of the painting. And so there is great peace in this kitchen, and there is domestic tranquility. There is a beauty created by Anna Kerner's domesticity. And then there's the violence of Carl Kerner, who was a violent man, represented by his dog and by the log that then became the kind of representation of the dog. There's your latent violence. And so what a combination. I mean, it's a reason why you just can't stop looking at this picture, why you never get tired of looking at it, why it's always unsettling, why it's always kind of moving around on you. It's because it's got all of this depth in it of things that he thought about and that he left out or that he changed and moved around. So no, this is not photographic realism. This is memory and magic. And that's kind of the lesson that I wanted to tell. Well, Andy, interestingly enough, did not like his studies being shown with his work. He always had a policy that he disapproved when people asked for things on loan. He didn't want to have the studies shown with the work. But he was very pleased with this. And at the end of the exhibition, he gave us the studies that we had in the exhibition as a kind of thank you present and as a recognition that actually we were doing something useful in trying to interpret his work to visitors. Well, this is one of my favorite pictures. This shows Andy and Betsy on just the day before the opening of the exhibition. They came in to see the show all by themselves. And I was fit to be tied. I was very nervous because I was worried that he wasn't going to be pleased with how we'd installed it and how everything looked. He was absolutely tied in knots. I mean, he was just like a little boy. He was so nervous. And I thought to myself, my God, this is like world famous Andrew Wyeth. And he's like nervous about the opening of his own retrospective. He was just clinging to Betsy, the two of them, as they went through the door. And he walked into the first gallery and he kind of did like a 360. And he said, "Oh my God, the light is so good." And I just heaved this huge sigh of relief because I could tell that it was going to be okay. And then he just straightened up and smiled and sailed through the rest of the show. He was worried. I mean, as famous, as accomplished as he was worried that it wasn't going to look good. And, it was the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It was his home museum. He was very excited, and he was, I think, ultimately really pleased. So, boy, was I gratified. That was like a moment like this, curator, like, whew.
That's lovely to hear. And I should share with our attendees that crucial vignette you shared has been really important to us going forward, that we, at this crucial moment in Memory and Magic, through Kathy's argument that the studies deserve to be seen, are ready to be seen, that the work won't be, the finished work won't suffer from showing the process for it, we get a kind of a green light to show the unfinished work, the studies, all this stuff that had never previously been shown. So that's really important. That's just one of the legacies of this show. Wonderful to hear that the studies came into the PMA after that. How did the public respond is my next question.
Well, it was fantastic. And this is typical. It was really crowded. It was a huge success. Wyeth, I have to say, was also just, he swooned over the idea that he had his name in letters in the facade of the building. I mean, again, he'd been coming to this museum since he was a boy. So it was very, very exciting for him. I think one of the most meaningful things for me was a book that we had at the end, a kind of visitor comment book. So many enthusiastic and sentimental and kind of tear-stained comments in the book, showing to me that people were really looking hard. People were reading the labels, they were carefully studying the work. And indeed, there were a number of people who sort of said, "I never liked Wyeth, but now I do," kind of comments that was kind of what I was aiming for. So it was I think a big success. Yeah, we were very, very pleased.
Great to hear. So we are getting close to time, and I want to zoom out just a little bit, and we'll be sure to leave a little time for the questions that have been submitted in the Q&A, and please do feel free to put in others before we finish. I'm curious about your perspective. You've kind of moved on from these chapters where you full-time focused on one Wyeth or another. You are now on the board of the Wyeth Foundation for American Art. You have this bird's eye view of historical art of the United States in general. where do you see the scholarly and museum practice of Wyeth studies now, and what are your hopes for the future?
Well, I would say that it's destined to go in two directions. And in one direction would be like the close looking kind of study of the Groundhog Day. In other words, doing this sort of deep dive into his process and looking at individual pictures and, trying to understand their meaning. And so that's like going in for like the fine grain of his work and technique and all those aspects. The other, I think, is like to zoom out a little bit more and think about Wyeth in context. That is, think about him in the frame of the 20th century. It was certainly a trope of the mid 20th century to see him in isolation, to sort of shove him off to Chad's Ford as, again, this kind of relic of 19th century realism. And I think in the last, say, 20 years, maybe 25 years, there's been a greater effort to not only understand him as a person of the 20th century, but to understand him in the context of his colleagues, of the artists that he knew, because he went to New York all the time and looked at exhibitions. And so he wasn't like living on another planet. So I think it will be interesting to see him in the frame of regionalism, to think about the sort of Hopper legacy that he grew up with. I think Michael Taylor, in his essay in the Memory and Magic catalog, started to poke at his relationship to surrealism, because in the 40s, he was seen as part of magic realism, as a phenomenon. And I think setting him in that frame, and then your abstract flash exhibition, I think also is like making people understand how he is the colleague of Motherwell and of Jackson Pollock, and that there is a generational sensibility here that connects him to the moderns. So I think that's sort of the bird's eye view here from seeing the entire 20th century and where he sits in it. Then the other thing I think and I know you're embracing this, is to look at Betsy Wyeth and her partnership. She was an artist herself, and she was tremendously important to Andrew Wyeth. And so I think there's a lot to be learned. I think she has been sort of suppressed in the telling of these stories. And so I'm looking forward to what you do with the story of Betsy.
Great to hear. We're looking forward to that too. She is an inspiring figure that we're lucky to get to know through the archive, through her work to preserve those studies, to help us understand the process, collecting them from the studio floor and helping us to see how ideas take shape. So couldn't have said it better. Maybe last but not least, can you tell us what you're working on now and what can we expect in the future from Kathy Foster?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, buy your tickets now. Mary Cassatt is opening at the Philadelphia Museum on May 18th. That is a team effort. It's being led by our curator of European art, Jennifer Thompson, and our curator of prints and drawings, Laurel Garber. But I'm like on the team here, contributing to the catalog, writing about Mary Cassatt's pastels. And it's a show called Mary Cassatt at Work. That is I think it's going to put Cassatt in a different frame for people to help you. It's got a feminist twist, a technical twist, ways of looking at Cassatt, I think, that haven't really been done. So I think you're going to be in for surprises when you see this show. I raised my hand in order to write about the pastels because I've actually been working on American pastel. I kind of gravitated from watercolor into pastel, which is actually what happened in the 1870s and 80s. As many artists who got excited about watercolor then started to make prints, and they started to make pastels. And so I sort of followed that train, and I've got an essay that's going to be coming out next year on early 20th century pastel. In thinking about this, it's interesting to me that none of the Wyeths have used pastel. And I haven't really thought about why. I don't know why they wouldn't, because Mary Cassatt loved pastel, and really most of her work is in pastel, and she loved the color and the texture of it. So I'm going to have to give it minutes thought to like why NC didn't use pastel, Jamie doesn't use pastel. Yeah, It's not in the family DNA, and I haven't figured that out yet. So I'll let you know when I figure it
Okay.
out.
I think that presents a perfect segue to one of our attendee submitted questions, which is about something that maybe was in the DNA. Do you have any reflections on NC and watercolor? And is there any direct watercolor inheritance there? We have this, maybe I'll quickly bring our audience up to speed in case you haven't heard already. The received narrative is watercolor happens because of Andrew Wyeth's artist brother-in-law, Peter Hurd. We don't talk a lot about his father as a watercolorist. I don't know that I've ever seen an NC watercolor. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yes, I do. And I think it's because his NC didn't do watercolor.
Okay.
And so I think in terms of coming out from under the enormous shadow of NC, who was such a giant and literally a big guy, but also a big father figure, I think Andy was trying to find a path that was not his father's path.
Understood. Lots of nice comments here in the Q&A. Fabulous presentation. Enjoy. Gratitude for feeling I was at this talk. And people who remember the exhibit fondly. Fascinating journey. So lots of nice comments. Thank you all for being with us. One mundane question I don't know the answer to. Can people see Groundhog Day currently on view, or is it behind the scenes right now? We can check the collections online.
It is not on view
Okay.
right now.
Okay.
It was, and it's now not on view. Sorry.
Okay. But we'll try to see it before long back out
I'm always
there.
agitating to get it out. Yes.
Yeah, understood. But meanwhile, Kathy and I were talking before this talk about it. I think a little bit of an underrated tempera that she gets to play with at the PMA. Public sale is growing on me. Everybody knows Groundhog Day is the iconic Wyeth at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but check out Public Sale if you haven't seen that one already.
It's a fantastic painting, an early painting. Yeah.
Incredible. So I need to spend more time with that one myself.
That's a painting that needs to get set in that frame of regionalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a topic, I guess, for another day. The problem of regionalism for Wyeth. Wyeth as an insufficiently urban artist for the art world of the latter part of the 20th century. And I know you could teach us all so much about that. So we'll have to bring you back another time. One attendee asks a name that came up in passing and wondered if you have any more to say about connections between Birchfield and Wyeth as fellow travelers in this 20th century watercolor moment. You see any shared?
I've never read anything about an intersection of them. But it's a great point. I mean, it's a great comment because there should be something there. Somebody should go and dig that out and find out, like, what did Andy know about Birchfield? Did they ever meet? You know, it's really a great question.
Mm-hmm. I think we can point to a jury that they were on together. That's the only contact I'm aware of. But yeah, I wish we could point to letters talking about watercolor technique. I haven't seen that kind of smoking gun yet. A few folks are raising their hands. We don't have a way to let you ask a question verbally, so please do type it into Q&A quickly. We've gone a little over time here, so might have to take a rain check on that. Let me see if there are any others. A few about artist materials. We do know he used Wapman and Fabriano papers. Let's see. People are asking for two things that we might not be able to oblige on. One person would really love to see your dissertation. I don't know if that's anywhere in a public database by now. And
you don't have to read my dissertation because everything smart in it got put into the American Watercolor and Winslow Homer, and in the age of Homer and Sargent. And improved and made better. Yes.
So I'm starting off camera to fetch my unblur background spontaneously and show my well-thumbed copy of that glorious book that was so influential for so many. So that's the way to get to know Kathy's life journey with watercolor. Another question was, can we ever listen in on your interview with Andrew Wyeth? You mentioned that you got to speak with him.
It was not recorded. No, It was just on the phone, actually. I was sort of disappointed. It was hard to get to him. And it was done kind of, with a deadline looming, and the only way I could talk to him was on the phone. And so, yeah, alas.
Understood. Maybe we need to wrap here, and apologies for anybody whose question we didn't get to. Let me throw one more in because you teased in your zoom out reflection on how we understand this creative legacy now, that one of the untold stories has been that of Betsy. Bringing it right back to some of the things you were talking about, do you see a role of Betsy in that fascinating creative process you walked us through of Groundhog Day? Does her role in that story extend beyond archiving it and helping us to tell that story? Is she a more active participant? Any thoughts?
I mean, the famous and probably well-known thought is, of course, that she titled his paintings, and she titled Groundhog Day. And so I think her role really comes in, as I've heard it, comes in at the last, when she is like his first critic and his first booster, and helps with the sort of launch of a finished tempera. But everything I've ever heard, and this is also from like Joyce Hill Stoner and others, is that nobody got into his studio when he was working. And the sketches that I showed you from Groundhog Day were done in the field. They were done when he's rambling around out in the landscape, or literally crouched in the corner of the Kerner kitchen. And so I don't see Betsy either being like present in those moments, nor is he necessarily showing those sketches. I mean, I'm hoping that you and your work on this, on the Betsy project, will find out more about whether in the middle of a project, because Groundhog Day took place over months, the development of the idea and then the final painting of the tempera. It's a long, long process. If anywhere in there he would come to her at dinner and say, I'm working on this, and show her his sketches. I have no idea whether that happened. I've never heard that it did. Maybe it did.
The only thing I can think of is that famous early story that Richard Merriman tells about the parting of the ways with NC and Betsy. NC saying, what is it, Turkey Point, I think is the title, needs a more overt narrative, put a gun in the hand of the figure. And Betsy slammed the door so hard the rafters shook. And there's this kind of protection of her husband's creative process, but does she ever insert a suggestion? I don't know. So yeah, we'll be on the lookout for that. Clearly had strong ideas.
Really
Clearly
good
really
question.
important.
It's a really good question, and I just don't know.
Understood. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kathleen Foster of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, for spending your evening with us. Thank you all for joining us for this Wyeth conversation. Please do come and see our exhibitions, Jamie Wyeth Unsettled and Every Leaf and Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination, on site at the Brandywine Museum of Art. And be sure to go and see Kathy's collaborative project on Mary Cassatt coming up May 18th, I think he said, at the Philadelphia Museum. Thank you.